Well,
that
you know, I
almost,
think
yeah.
everybody. I mean, like all things, the good is the reflection of the bad in a way. You know, I mean, there is, without doubt, there's this kind of entrepreneurial zeal in the United States, which is so charismatic. You know, I first went to college because I used to fight forest fires in British Columbia when I was 15, and all our camps were overrun by U.S. draft dodgers. Because it was the only work they could get. And we were these sort of obsequious, obedient Canadian lads, and these Americans would tell our bosses to piss off. It was irresistibly charismatic. And one of them had the Life magazine with the Harvard student strike of 1969 on the cover. And as a kid of just 15, in a kind of raw atavistic way, I thought, well, that's got to be the college you go to become cool like these Americans. And so I applied to Harvard, not really knowing where it was. And I got in, and I flew down to Boston. My family didn't have the means to come with me. And I landed at Logan Airport at the age of, I guess I was 17. And I realized I didn't even really know where Harvard was. And I saw this African-American guy with a Harvard t-shirt. I thought, he's got to know, but he didn't know either. And I dragged my trunk through the subway because my family didn't take taxis. And I ended up coming up in Harvard Square in 1970, 71 in this kind of caravanserai of madness with Hare Krishna and STS, naked women. And I mean, I thought I was in heaven. I realized that my mom and dad had made a mistake, and they sent me down to the States 5 days before the dorms were open. I had no money, and I was my big steamer trunk, and I dragged that trunk through the streets of Cambridge until I found a church, and I knocked on the door, and this wonderfully benevolent pastor opened up the door, and he put me up for a week, and that's when I fell in love with the United States. That kindness, you know, that kindness to strangers, which seems to be somewhat wanting at the moment. And you know, that wonderful American spirit, sort of do what needs to be done and then ask whether it's possible or permissible. A kind of spirit that says that, you know, pessimism is an indulgence, that despair is an insult to imagination, orthodoxy the enemy of invention. You know, people like Jim Whittaker, the first American to climb Everest, who famously said, if you're not living on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space. And certainly I could never have forged the career that I did in Canada. It just would never have happened. So, you know, when I wrote this piece for Rolling Stone, you know, I think of it as a love letter in a way to a country where, you know, if you have a family member, Satya, who's in trouble, the first stage of a family intervention is to hold a mirror to the face of the individual to show how far they've fallen, and that's the first step on the path of rehabilitation. And the entire thrust of this article is really that COVID has kind of reduced to tatters the illusion of American exceptionalism. Americans woke up to find themselves literally members of a failed state, ruled by a dysfunctional government headed by an individual recommending the use of bathroom disinfectants for the treatment of a disease that intellectually he did not have the capacity to understand.
Sure. I want to pause. You said something so incredible. I just want to almost highlight it. It sounds like you love the U.S. so much, like a family member, and you know that the most powerful thing you can do to help it in its process is to hold up a mirror. Yeah. And that's really the perspective that this article is coming from.
Yeah, I mean, what the article describes is something that will cause Americans who love their country to feel sadness, because it's not a pretty picture. You know, it's interesting. Epidemics and pandemics have a way of shifting or moving the wheel of history. The Black Death, for example, wiped out half the population of Europe, and it brought to the end a medieval system of governance that had lasted 1,000 years. By contrast, the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, which killed millions of people, including my own grandfather, who walked out of his home in the morning and was dead by afternoon, it didn't have the same impact socially, psychologically, in a sense, because it happened in a moment when the entire world was numb by death because of the Great War. By the same token, during the year of Woodstock, the summer of Woodstock, when 500,000 kids took drugs and swam around in the mud of a field in New York State, that summer 100,000 people died of Hong Kong flu. And in Berlin, they were using subway stations to store the cadavers because the morgues were overrun. But again, that didn't have the same impact. We didn't have digital technology, communications as we do today, and most people had never been in an airplane in the 1960s, so the disease was not spreading with the same intensity. But in the case of COVID, it came along right at a time to reveal what had become of America. And as 2,000 Americans were dying every day, an American dying every minute, every hour, we suddenly looked up and saw a nation, in a sense, in tatters. You know, the Irish Times put it perhaps most poignantly when they said in an article that over the years, America has evoked many emotions from other people in the world, from good or bad, or for loving or hating or whatever. But there's one emotion that America has never invoked until now, and that was pity. And as American frontline healthcare workers literally awaited emergency supplies of fundamental needs and basic stuff like swabs and bandages, etc., from China, the hinge of history opened to the Asian century. And, you know, empires never anticipate their demise, but kingdoms are born to die. And if you think of European history, the 15th century belonged to the Portuguese, the 16th to the Spanish, the 17th to the Dutch, the 18th to the French, the 19th to the British. The British Empire actually reached its greatest geographical extent, Satya, in 1935. You know, Brits all over the world were kind of swilling their gin and tonics, but we now, of course, know that the empire was bankrupt and bled white by the Great War, and the torch had passed to America. And so if we kind of look at the trajectory of America in the 20th century, you know, it's hard for people to remember that on the eve of World War II, the United States was a demilitarized country. Both Portugal and Bulgaria had bigger armies than the United States. And then within 3 years, we had 18 million men and women serving in uniform. The United States industrial might saved literally civilization along with Russian blood. The Ford Motor Company produced more industrial output than the nation of Italy. One plant in Detroit, the Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal, produced more tanks than the entire German Third Reich. We built B-24s, each one of which had 1,500,000 parts. We spat them out by the hour. We built Liberty ships by the hour. The record for building a Liberty ship was 4 days, 29 hours, and 17 minutes. For every 5 pounds of equipment the Japanese Empire of the Sun got to a frontline troop per capita, America got 2 tons across 13,000 kilometers of water and literally saved civilization. And when I say that, I'm not speaking in hyperbole. You know, the Nazis had an overt plan to deport every able-bodied man from the United Kingdom, 15 to 45, to slave labor in Europe. This was civilization on the precipice. And then in the wake of the victory, with Europe in ashes and Japan prostrate, the United States, with but 4% of the world's population, controlled 50% of the world's economy, made 90% of the world's automobiles. And that extraordinary concentration of affluence allowed for a truce between capital and labor that gave us the weekend, that gave us the prosperous working class, a time when a man with limited education could have a good job, could buy a home, buy a car, put his kids through good local public schools. And that was the kind of the dream of America. It's a dream in which all boats rose with the tide. You know, people far right get nostalgic for the 1950s. It certainly wasn't a great period of time if you were a person of color, a woman, if you were gay. But in economic terms, the country, in fact, resembled Denmark more than it does the America of today. marginal tax rates in the 1950s were 90%. Now, that doesn't mean that wealthy people all paid 90%.
Sure.
The symbol was there that everybody has to pay. You know, the average CEO, my father-in-law was CEO of Bell & Howell Company in the 1950s. They made all the Hollywood cameras. His income was just 20 times that of an average salaried staff member of his team. Today, that discrepancy would be more like, 400 times. And one of the things that has torn the country apart is economic injustice. The fact that globalization has been celebrated with iconic intensity for 2 generations, when every working man and woman knows that globalization is nothing more or less than capital on the prowl in search of cheap labor. And when we now live in a world where the discrepancies are such that the top 1% controls more than the bottom half of the population, where 1% of the population has $30 trillion in assets, the bottom half of the American public have more debts than assets. The 3 richest individuals in America have more wealth than the entire 160 million of the poorest people in the country.
And sure, I want to jump in. I want to, your article is really resonating. It has, I think, 300 million views last I checked. That's unheard of, right?
Yeah, the story's sort of become a story. I mean, it's trended #1 on the Rolling Stone website for a month.
Sure.
I think Jan told me 4 to 5 million people have seen on the Rolling Stone. As I said, as of a week ago, 350 million people, social media impressions worldwide. And I think it's speaking of some kind of yearning, because,
Right. I think more, right. I think what the numbers represent is that it's resonating with people, right? More than it being #1, it's like, wow, like this is sparking something in them. At that level, it's sparking a strong emotion. What do you think that emotion is that people are connecting to?
There's two major responses. Obviously, those who are sympathetic or open to the ideas expressed, who love their country but have seen it unraveling before their eyes and recognize it as such, generally express incredible sadness and hope that the country can correct its course. Coming in from the other side, if you will, are incredibly vitriolic, vicious, generally misogynist critiques which have nothing to do with the content of the article. It's almost like I've been called everything from menstrual discharge to, the terms that come in. And it's curious because the people who have that response seem to be singularly incapable of dealing with the issues and the data presented in the article or the arguments of that article. It's sort of their only gut response is hatred and really quite vicious language directed toward the messenger, because they can't deal with the message. But again, this article is not in any way gloating. It's not celebrating the demise of America. It's a lament. But the bottom line is that a country that once spat out fighter planes by the hour couldn't manage to get it together to get cotton swabs and had to depend on overseas supplies. A country that defeated polio and smallpox found itself led by a president advertising the use of bathroom disinfectants. A country that celebrated the free flow of information is in fact ranks 45th in terms of press freedom. A country that celebrates freedom as an individual's right to own a personal arsenal of weaponry, even a right that trumps the well-being of children. 346 kids being killed in schools over the last decade.
Let's talk about the individual for a moment. I love that you're talking about that. And what's curious, right, is that maybe here's a question. What can somebody do to look around at their life and feel this discrepancy that has motivated you to write this article? Your love of America.
Again, it's like anything else. You can't solve a problem until you understand its dimensions. And one of the things you asked me earlier at the very head of our conversation, what do I love about America? Of course, what I love about America is the way that the country celebrates the individual. This gives us huge mobility, huge flexibility, huge personal freedom, but it also comes at the cost of social solidarity. In a sense, the United States has lost not just a sense of community, but the very idea of society itself. It's almost as if no one owes anything to anyone and no one is deserving of anything. And if you look at, what we've become, I mean, the American people consume 2/3 of the world's antipsychotic drugs. Opioid addiction is a cause of mortality, the highest cause of mortality for people below the age of 50. Addiction is a cause of mortality, the highest cause of mortality for people below the age of 50. We celebrate slogans like 24/7, implying total dedication to the workplace at the expense of family, and then we wonder why the average American youth fully the glass screen, be it a laptop or a video game, contributing to an obesity epidemic that is described by the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a national security crisis. I mean, go to any sporting, look for example, at a photograph of any sporting event in the 1940s, and you'll be hard pressed to find anyone who is overweight. Now look at a sporting event and you're hard pressed to find anyone who is not, if not clinically obese, certainly overweight. And it's almost like the country no longer has a sense of benign purpose. When, for example, people flock to the beaches or mock the use of a mask or go to conventions, they're not displaying strength or freedom. They're actually displaying the weakness of a people who lack the stoicism to endure the pandemic or the fortitude to defeat it. Donald Trump is the target of much ire from the left, but he's not the cause of this decline. He's a symptom of the descent. And the perfect sort of sign of the decadence is the fact that in 2016, 62 million Americans voted their grievance. They voted their indignation. They voted for their own self-interest in terms of that set of emotions of anger and vitriol and so on. And in doing so, they elected someone who they knew bloody well had no credentials for the job, save his willingness to validate their hatreds and target their enemies, real and imagined. That is a sign of decadence. And that's what Oscar Wilde, in a sense, meant when he quipped that America was the only country to go from barbarism to decadence without passing through civilization. And let me try to explain. COVID's unveiled this. I mean, think about this. Canada is no perfect place, that's for sure. Our medical system is no perfect system, but it does focus on the collective, not the individual, and certainly not the private investor who views every hospital bed as if it's a rental property. On July 30th of this summer, even as the Americans announced 59,629 new cases of COVID in all of British Columbia. Again, we have a major concentration in the metropolitan area of Vancouver. We're an Asian city. We have dozens of flights coming in from China and elsewhere in East Asia every day. We're 2 hours up up the road from Seattle, where the pandemic landed in the United States, logically we should have been hammered by this. But on the very day that the Americans were announcing 60,000 new cases of COVID in all of our hospitals in British Columbia, a province with a population roughly comparable to that of Massachusetts, we had only 5 cases of COVID. So what is going on here that wasn't going on in the United States? What is going on in New Zealand? What is going on in Australia? What is going on in Denmark? You know, it's often said in America that, you know, social democracies are communism light, or it'll never work in America. And that may be true, but if so, it's a stunning indictment. Social democracies have nothing to do with socialism. They're simply dynamic capitalist economies which focus on the well-being of every tier of society. You know, I always try to explain the difference to my American friends and family members by using an allegory of getting your groceries at Safeway. When you get your groceries at a Safeway anywhere in the United States, pretty well, there's a kind of an economic, social, racial, class, educational chasm between you and the checkout person that's very difficult to bridge. And when you get your groceries in Canada, Denmark for that matter, you don't feel that chasm. It doesn't mean that you necessarily interact as peers. It doesn't mean that you may not have more education or less education, more wealth, less wealth than the checkout person, but you do interact as if members of a wider community. And why is that? It's very simple. They know that you know that they're getting a living wage because of the unions. And they know that you know that probably their kids go to the same neighborhood public school, which critically in British Columbia, for example, are not funded by property taxes, which benefit the children of the affluent and the affluent neighborhoods, but funded by state grants that give every kid per capita the same chance for educational advancement. And third, and most important, they know that you know that if their kids get sick, they will get not only exactly the same medical care as your children, but those of the Prime Minister. And those 3 strands woven together become the social fabric of democracy in a place like Denmark, Canada, or New Zealand. You know, healthcare in the States seems to be always an issue of insurance, of political antagonisms, of even medical care, but actually healthcare is not about medicine. Healthcare is about social solidarity. It's about fairness. It's about sending a message that everybody counts. And that is what is missing today in America. People do not feel that they count. And that is the origin of the anger that inspires and fuels the supporters of President Trump. I'll give you one final example that I think really is quite beautiful. Sachi, when my mother was 85, she got a headache at 11 o'clock in the morning. By 1 o'clock, she was in neurosurgery, being operated on by the greatest neurosurgeon in Canada. He saved her life. And by the time my sister and I got to the intensive care unit, my mother, of course, was in recovery. But there was another family in that same unit with a young girl who had suffered the same kind of aneurysm and was a farm girl from Manitoba, surrounded by a dozen of her family members. Now, it was very moving because she had gotten exactly the care my mother had gotten, and both my mother and that girl were saved by that incredible neurosurgeon. Now, if that had happened in the States, my sister and I, she's a prominent lawyer, I've done well, we could have paid whatever bill there was. That farm family from Manitoba in the States could well have faced a choice between the well-being of their child and the economic well-being of their family. We don't think in Canada that that's a choice that anyone should have to make in a civilized nation. Now, the fanciest hotel in Victoria, where this hospital was, one of the Fairmont hotels now, it's the legendary Empress Hotel, one of the old CP Railroad hotels, had a rule that any family member of any Canadian in an ICU unit at any hospital in Victoria got a free room for the night. So after we were chased out of the ICU by the nurses, we all piled into our vehicles and we poured down to the hotel where we all went to have a drink together. Now the family from Manitoba were all Christian and they didn't drink at all. So I bought apple juice and orange juice all around, and my sister and I had a beer perhaps, and we toasted, but we didn't toast the survival of our loved ones, although it was very much in our hearts. And we didn't toast each other. And we didn't even toast the hotel for being so generous and kind to us. We toasted our country for having a healthcare system that brought us together from two different sides of the economic spectrum in Canada, but united in grief for our loved ones, but also united in hope and the realization that our country did not let either one of us down in a moment of incredible peril. That is what universal health care is all about. It's about people feeling that it's right, that they have a part of the overall story of America, that their children won't get sick and have no services. You know, it's things like that that create social solidarity. And until America finds a way to come together, to bridge this chasm that is so wide and so deep, it's hard to imagine how the nation will have a chance to move forward, certainly into another century of dominance. You know, think of it this way. You know, if we went into World War II a demilitarized society, we never stood down after the war. You know, we have American soldiers in 150 countries today. China hasn't gone to war once since the 1970s. The United States hasn't once been at peace. We've spent $6 trillion on military adventures since 2000. In those same years, China has been building its country, pouring more cement every 3 years than America did in the entire 20th century. So, all of these are the signs of a country in retreat. And the biggest question for America, I think, emotionally, psychologically, how will a country that has been raised on the myth of its exceptionalism deal with a new reality? How is it that a country that, once welcomed the huddled masses of the world, how is it that more people now favor the building of a wall along the southern border to keep desperate mothers and their children out, mothers and children who are desperately there because of our policies in the 1980s and 90s in wars in Central America that dislocated the entire civil society, and our consumption of cocaine today, which has facilitated the illegal trade, which now is sweeping like a firestorm through the Central American nations, through Mexico, and to our borders. I even go as far, Satya, as maintaining that those in favor of building a wall along the American-Mexican border are not only misguided, it's an act of treason. Because what, after all, is a definition of treason? It's when you betray the essence of your country, when you betray the better angels of your nature. It's when you deny the ideals for which your ancestors fought and died in countless wars. That is, to my mind, what treason is. Treason isn't when you refuse to go along with flag-wrapped patriotism at a convention. Freedom is not flaunting the well-being of your fellow citizens by refusing to follow basic medical advice that has nothing to do with politics. So, again, I stress it, nothing I wrote in that article is in any way an attempt to gloat. There's nothing to celebrate, believe me. If and when the torch of history, the hinge of history, if you will, opens to an Asian century with China dominant, China with its treatment of ethnic groups in the concentration camps of the Northwest, the treatment of democracy in the streets of Hong Kong, with its social capital measures of the individual, measuring deviance from orthodoxy and the state, when it, and its treatment of press freedoms and so on, we will be longing for the best years of the American century. And it's my fervent hope, in a sense, that the prognosis that is distilled in this Rolling Stone article, The Unraveling of America, nobody would more prefer to be shown to be totally wrong than me.
That's beautiful. I love that phrase, fervent hope. And I love the humility in you to say, I hope I'm wrong about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Absolutely. It gets back to this idea that, you've got to look, you can't deny what the society has become, as I say, flag wrap patriotism is no match for compassion. And you have a situation where the truth has become whatever people want it to be. If the first American president famously couldn't tell a lie, the current one literally cannot recognize the truth. If Abraham Lincoln asked for charity for all and malice toward none, this troll of a president, in my opinion, has inverted that by seeking malice for all and charity for none. But again, Trump, odious as I think he is not the cause of this. He is a symptom of the descent. And everybody who has facilitated the division between people. One of the things that is very Canadian, I suppose, is that you grew up in a land like this where for most of our history there were more lakes than people, where the weight of the winter hovers in the north. We are a civil society. We practice consilience. We do get along with each other. The idea of a Canadian politician wrapping themselves in the flag makes no sense. We didn't even have one until 1965, and then the country came to a standstill as we argued as to one or three maple leafs. The most perfect expression of our muted patriotism is the line of Francophone verse from the great poet Gilles Vigneault, who said, "Mon pays n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver." My country is not a country, it's the winter. And yet at the same time, we measure wealth not by the currency accumulated by the lucky few, but by the strength of social relations and the bonds of reciprocity that bind all of us in common purpose. That is, to my mind, the definition of a civilized nation.
So, where do we go from here?
Well, one thing that you mentioned, I've recently written a book, Magdalena, River of Dreams, which is kind of a love letter toward Colombia, and I recently was made an honorary Colombian citizen by President Juan Manuel Santos, a Nobel laureate, and Colombia has always been a place very close to my heart. When I was 14, my mother, kind of a humble but determined Canadian woman, told me that Spanish was the language of the future, and she worked all year as a secretary to earn enough money to allow me to join a small group of schoolboys that a teacher was taking to Colombia in the summer of 1968. And it was an extraordinary exposure to me. Many of the other older Canadian lads suffered from what the Colombians called mamitis, or homesickness. And I, by contrast, felt like I had finally found home. And but Colombia, of course, is another nation that's been torn asunder. A 50-year war, a three-way war, which has led to 220,000 dead, 7 million internally displaced. But the fuel of that war has always been cocaine. And, the war wouldn't have lasted a day. The paramilitaries wouldn't have come into being. The FARC would have fizzled out years ago if it hadn't been for cocaine. At the height of the cartel, the Medellin cartel was budgeting $1,000 a week just to buy elastic bands. to wrap the $70 million a day they were making. And the last year before the Havana Agreement that brought peace, the FARC were down to 6,000 cadre, mostly teenagers in search of 3 meals a day. And yet the FARC were making $600 million from cocaine. And if you give me, the Burning Man Boy Scouts and $600 million, I can wreak havoc in the state of Nevada. And so one of the messages of the book is that, in a sense, we all owe something to Colombia. Even as Colombia, the world's falling apart, and Colombia's falling together. But we should remember that, how do we feel in the States, for example, if Canada had patterns of drug consumption and in boards and barrooms across the country, and also drug laws that didn't really do much to curb the illicit trade but made possible that trade, such that 85 million Americans were forced to flee from their homes. Well, that per capita is what happened to Colombians. And yet through all those years, Colombia maintained civil society and democracy, greened its cities, sought restitution with First Nations, created millions of acres of national parks, and now is poised for this kind of amazing intellectual, artistic, and economic renaissance. And people are suddenly realizing this is not a country of violence and drugs. This is a place of colores y cariño, where, the richest biodiversity on Earth. There is no place in Colombia more than a day removed from every known ecosystem to be found on the planet Earth, and so on, and more species of birds than any other, and of course culture and music and everything. And magical realism celebrated as Gabriel Garcia Marquez's contribution to Latin American literature. He was a journalist. He was a practicing journalist all his life. He just wrote about what he saw. He just happened to live in a place where heaven and earth come together on a regular basis to reveal glimpses of the divine. And there is a lesson, the book is Magdalena, which is the Mississippi of Colombia. And in the same way that the Mississippi is a corridor of commerce and also a fountain of culture, the Magdalena is a source of music and poetry, prayer and literature. And the schism between the Colombian people, fueled by the cocaine trade, became extraordinarily violent. There is no one who hasn't suffered. And what has brought the country together, to the extent that it is tentatively walking toward peace, is just pure collective exhaustion. Generally, when nations are torn asunder by polarization, whether it's Ireland or whether it's South Africa or whether it's Colombia or now the United States, the one hope is there comes a point when people are just collectively had enough. In Colombia, 2 schoolboys just got on Facebook and said, "No más FARC," no more FARC. And 3 weeks later, 2 million people were in the streets of Bogota with that slogan. And the States has been torn apart before. We forget how truly horrible the McCarthy years were, where this alcoholic troll of a man from Wisconsin was the most powerful man in Washington. People were terrified of his ire, of his rhetoric, of his accusations. Careers were ruined from the United Nations to Hollywood by this extraordinarily awful man. And then suddenly his power, which had sort of ebbed for a number of years, and there was that one fantastic moment where a senator, largely unknown today, simply spoke those powerful words, "Sir, have you no shame? At last you have no shame." And the artifice of McCarthyism cracked like porcelain, like a glass, and the man was dead from alcoholism, within months. So, the nightmare that America is facing will not be solved by the election in November. Even if Biden wins handily, there will still be a deeply disaffected cohort, which is the core Trump supporters. And Donald Trump will do everything he can to exasperate that division for his own self-interest and his own vanity. So it'll take more than the election of a Democrat, just as it will to heal America, just as it will take more than the re-election of Trump to destroy America, finally. But what will bring America together is when the people of America, the vast majority of Americans, simply say, enough, we're better than this. This is not who we are. You know, we are the country of Abraham Lincoln. We are the country of the Grateful Dead. We are the country of Walt Whitman. And let's be that country again. And that's when things will change. After all, Burning Man did not start in Brussels. You know, Burning Man didn't start in Vancouver. Burning Man didn't start in Paris or in Delhi or in Beijing. It started on a beach in California with the best dreams of the American century still ahead. And so, you know, any country that can pull off something like Burning Man sure has another chance on life.
I appreciate that. Wade, I love that your work is so focused on others to the extent of focusing on nations. I'm curious what drives you to have such a, you know, for that to be your interest, for that to be something you want to hold a mirror to. I'm just really curious about, you know, where that comes from.
Well, Satya, you know, I'm a storyteller. I'm an old Irish storyteller. It's in my blood, I think, you know. You know, Hemingway said that, he said a bunch of things. He said, you know, anyone who thinks that writing is easy is either a bad writer or a liar. And you know, writing is hard. That's what makes it great. And I at least feel that to be motivated to complete a book, and I've written 23 books, you know, you have to have some sense of passion, some sense of mission, some sense of correcting, you know, exposing, or maybe even hopefully doing something about injustice in wherever it flares up, or at least drawing people's attention to the passions of the past, or something emotive, you know, that's it, you know, and he also said that the most important credential for a writer is to have something to say that the world needs to hear. And you know, I've always been driven since that first exposure in that church in Cambridge at the age of 17, and even before then, to social justice. You know, I saw what the treatment of women did to my mother, destroyed her life. She would have been running Bell and Howell Company if she'd been alive a generation later, you know. So, I mean, I was a feminist before the concept was there. I grew up in that atmosphere. I grew up, you know, my closest friend, Tim Plowman, died of AIDS. You know, I could go on and on, you know. But the other thing is that, you know, my father wasn't a religious man, but he was a deeply ethical man. And he did believe in good and evil. And, you know, he said, you know, there's good and evil in the world. Take your side and get on with it. And that's pretty good advice. And one of the things that is, you know, in the Christian tradition, we have this sort of illusion that, you know, we have the Christ child and we have the fallen archangel, and we have this illusion that good's going to triumph sometime over evil. That if we just push hard enough, you know, that evil will go away. Well, that's a very Western idea. In the East, for example, when Krishna was famously asked by a disciple what he, you know, why the obvious question, the great heresy of the medieval ages, you know, if God's all powerful, why does he allow evil to exist in the universe? Well, if you ask that in France in the year 1100, you'd be burned at the stake. But when you could ask that in India, and when Lord Krishna was asked that very question by a disciple, you know, if God's all powerful, why does he allow evil in the universe? Lord Krishna said, to thicken the plot. In other words, this is a whole dharma. You know, the whole idea of the Four Noble Truths. You know, in Buddhism, you know, all life is suffering. It doesn't mean that all life is negation. It means that shit happens, evil happens. The cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of people to cling to the cruel illusion of their own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the Noble Truths was a revelation that ignorance could be overcome. And then, of course, the fourth was the delineation of a contemplative practice that, if followed, not only had a possibility of a transformation of the human heart, but had 2,500 empirical years saying that transformation would happen. And, you know, one of the reasons that at the age of 66, I can stay as passionate, as engaged, as hopeful, indeed, as I am, is that I never expect to win. You know, bitterness comes to those who expect something, expect to win an environmental battle every time, or expect to succeed, or whatever it is. But if you realize that the path of life is not bringing you towards a destination, the path of life is just a path. And the journey you're on is exactly that. And the goal is not a destination, but a state of mind. Then you get the kind of, you know, you're able to just keep going, because you never expect to win. You don't really expect anything at all, and you're pushing the wheel. Hopefully, and it sounds a little precious and sanctimonious, but you're hoping that we're all hoping that we're pressing the wheel of justice and decency and kindness but it's not like we're going to get up to that mountaintop. You know, no, you have to keep doing it. And the whole thing in life is that, you know, to be the architect, the biggest challenge in life, the creative challenge, is to be the architect of your own life. And you always see, when you meet someone in their later years, the people who are bitter are the ones who look back on a lifetime of choices imposed upon them by peers or society or internal pressures. And people who are happy in older age are always those who can look back and realize that they may have not always made every choice the right one, but they owned all those choices, and they were the architect of your own life. And that is the formula for contentment in old age. You know, when I was a really young boy wandering around Colombia, you know, when I was 19 and 20, sleeping where my hat fell, you know, kind of, you know, protected by a cloak of warmth from the Colombian people, I met an old shaman who told me something really amazing. He said, you know, in your early years, you're too young to understand the world around you. And in your later years, you're too old to understand the world coming at you from below or from behind. And in between, he said, there's a narrow sliver of light, this narrow beam of light that illuminates your life. And that is when your destiny is unveiled. So, you know, I always say to young people, always be patient and give your destiny time to find you.
That's powerful. And I know your time is precious. I know this is Sunday evening. Thank you for being here. I wonder if that was such a high note. I wonder if you also feel similarly that this might be a good time for us to take a pause.
Sure.
We'll talk to Daniel, and then I'm just so excited to bring you guys together.
It'd be great, Becca. No problem.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Wade, thank you so much. We're really honored to have you here projected. Oh, you should do something funny. We'll